Welcome back. You are listening to the home of forbidden romances. Prepare yourself, because tonight's story will leave you breathless. The heavy mahogany doors of the Vane Enterprises boardroom didn't just open. They were thrown wide with a violence that silenced the storm raging against the floor-to-ceiling windows, revealing a silhouette that Julian Vane had spent the last 3 years trying to scrub from his memory. Thunder rattled the glass, but the atmosphere inside the room was far more volatile. 12 members of the board sat in stunned silence, their eyes darting between the man standing at the head of the table, Julian, the Alpha CEO, whose ferocity was legendary, and the figure standing in the doorway. It was Soren Kale. But it wasn't the Soren that Julian remembered. The Soren of 3 years ago had been soft-spoken, wearing ill-fitting suits to hide his slender frame, smelling faintly of distress and cheap suppressants. He had been an efficient, terrifyingly intelligent executive assistant, yes, but he had been an Omega in a world designed for alphas. The man standing there now was a weapon forged in fire. Soren wore a bespoke suit of charcoal silk that hugged his waist and flared perfectly at the trousers, emphasizing the dangerous elegance of his stride. His hair, once kept in a modest cut, was now slightly longer, sweeping over a forehead that betrayed no emotion. But it was his scent, God, his scent, that hit Julian like a physical blow. Gone was the anxiety. In its place was the rich, intoxicating aroma of wild, night-blooming jasmine and cold steel. Soren walked into the room, flanked by 2 lawyers, and didn't stop until he reached the head of the table. He looked at Julian, who was gripping the back of his leather chair so hard the leather groaned. "You're in my seat, Mr. Vane," Soren said, his voice a velvet purr that carried a razor blade within it. Julian's lip curled, a low growl building in his chest. "Security," he barked, his eyes flashing gold. "Remove him. Now." "I wouldn't do that," the chairman of the board, an elderly beta named Elias, spoke up, his voice trembling. "Julian, sit down." Julian whipped his head around, disbelief warring with fury. "Excuse me." "Read the file, Julian," Soren said, tossing a thick black folder onto the polished wood. It slid across the surface and stopped inches from Julian's hand. "Vane Enterprises has been bleeding money for 6 quarters. Your aggressive acquisition strategy, the Alpha Way, as you so fondly called it, has alienated our European partners. The stock is in freefall." Soren leaned forward, planting his hands on the table, invading Julian's personal space with a fearlessness that made the air crackle. "The board voted this morning. The majority shareholder, my new employer, the Helios Group, has exercised their right to restructure management. I am the new acting CEO." Julian felt the blood drain from his face, replaced instantly by a rush of humiliation so hot it burned. "You," he spat. "You are an Omega. You were a secretary. I fired you because you were a liability." "You fired me," Soren corrected, his eyes narrowing into crescents of icy blue, "because my heat came early, and rather than following protocol, you decided my biology was an insult to your corporate aesthetic. You fired me because you couldn't control me, and you couldn't control yourself." The silence in the room was deafening. This was the dirty laundry no one spoke of. "And now," Soren whispered, close enough that Julian could see the gold flecks in his eyes, "I am your superior. You have 2 choices, Mr. Vane. You can walk out that door, forfeit your family's legacy, and watch me dismantle your father's empire from the outside. Or, you can sit down, accept the demotion to Vice President of Operations, and do exactly as I say." Julian Vane was a prime alpha. Submission was not in his DNA. Every instinct screamed at him to lunge, to dominate, to crush the threat. But he looked at the board members. They were looking at Soren with reverence, not him. He looked at the financial reports. Red ink. Ruin. If he left, he lost everything. If he stayed, he lost his pride. Julian's jaw locked. Slowly, agonizingly, he released his grip on the CEO's chair. He stepped aside. Soren didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply took the seat, crossed his legs, and looked up at Julian, who was now standing awkwardly to his right. "Good choice," Soren said, opening a file. "Pour me a glass of water, Julian. We have a lot of work to do." The first month was a masterclass in psychological warfare. The dynamic at Vane Enterprises shifted tectonically. Soren didn't rule with the shouting and intimidation that Julian had favored. Soren ruled with terrifying precision. He knew every employee's name. He knew the cleaning schedules. He knew where the budget leaks were, and he plugged them with ruthless efficiency. Julian, meanwhile, was relegated to a glass-walled office adjacent to Soren's, a fishbowl where everyone could see the fallen king. The humiliation was constant, but it wasn't the petty tasks that broke Julian, it was the competence. He had told himself for years that Omegas were too emotional for leadership, that their biology made them weak. Yet, he watched Soren navigate a hostile merger with a Japanese conglomerate without blinking, charming the alpha representatives while simultaneously dissecting their contract until they conceded millions. But the tension between them wasn't just professional. It was biological. Every time Soren walked past Julian's desk, the scent of jasmine spiked, triggering a confusing cocktail of rage and desire in Julian's blood. Julian found himself staring through the glass wall, watching the way Soren chewed the end of his pen, the way his neck arched when he was tired. It came to a head on a Tuesday night, late. The office was empty, the city lights below casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. Julian was packing up, exhausted. He had spent the day correcting his own previous errors under Soren's orders. He headed for the elevator, but the light from the CEO's office, Soren's office, was still on. Against his better judgment, Julian walked to the door. It was ajar. Soren was slumped over the desk, his head in his hands. The air in the room was thick, heavy with a scent that was sweeter, stickier than usual. Distress. And preheat. Julian froze. His alpha instincts, usually so disciplined, surged forward. Soren's head snapped up. His face was flushed, eyes glassy. He scrambled to open his desk drawer, fumbling for a pill bottle. It rattled, empty. Get out, Soren gasped, his voice straining. Leave, Julian. Julian stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. You're entering heat. I miscalculated, Soren gritted out, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the desk. My suppressants. The dosage changed. Go. Now. And leave you here? Vulnerable. Julian's voice dropped an octave. He walked closer, not as a predator, but drawn by a magnetic pull he couldn't resist. I am not vulnerable, Soren shouted, standing up, only to sway dangerously. I am your boss. I am ordering you to leave. You're shaking, Julian observed, stopping 3 feet away. The smell was overwhelming now. It was calling to him, singing to the deepest, most primitive parts of his brain. Mate. Claim. Protect. Why did you come back, Soren? Julian asked, his voice rough. You could have gone anywhere. You're brilliant. Why come back to the man who ruined you? Soren looked at him, his defenses crumbling under the biological onslaught. Tears of frustration pricked his eyes. Because, he whispered, I had to prove you wrong. I had to make you see me. Not as an Omega, but as your equal. I see you, Julian murmured. I haven't been able to stop seeing you for 3 years. Soren let out a shaky laugh. Liar. You fired me because I disgusted you. No. The word was torn from Julian's throat. He closed the distance, his hands hovering over Soren's shoulders, but not touching. I fired you because every time you walked into a room, I forgot how to breathe. I fired you because I was terrified that I would do something unprofessional, something that would ruin the company. I thought if I sent you away, the feeling would die. Julian looked down at the man who held his career in his hands. It didn't die. It starved. Soren stared up at him, the flush on his cheeks deepening. The admission hung in the air, heavier than the storm outside. You're an idiot, Soren breathed. I know. I should fire you. You should. Soren's knees buckled. Julian caught him instantly, his arms wrapping around the Omega's waist, pulling him flush against his chest. The contact was electric. A shockwave went through them both. Soren buried his face in Julian's neck, inhaling the alpha scent of cedar and rain. It was the only thing that could ground him. I have emergency suppressants in my safe, Soren whispered against Julian's skin. The code is your birthday. Julian froze. His birthday. For 3 years, while plotting his revenge, while building himself into a corporate titan, Soren had kept the code as Julian's birthday. Julian pulled back slightly, looking into Soren's eyes. Soren, get them, Soren commanded, though his voice was weak. Or take me home. Choose, Julian. But if you take me home, you don't get to be the boss. Not tonight. Julian didn't hesitate. He swept Soren up into his arms, carrying him bridal style toward the private elevator. I haven't been the boss since the moment you walked back through those doors. The truce was fragile, built on a foundation of pheromones and secrets, but it held. The next morning, Julian arrived at the office early. He placed a steaming cup of herbal tea, specifically brewed for post-heat recovery, on Soren's desk before anyone else arrived. When Soren walked in an hour later, looking composed but tired, he saw the tea. He looked through the glass wall. Julian was at his desk, head down, working on the logistics report Soren had assigned him. Soren took a sip. It was perfect. But the corporate world is not kind to romances, and it is even less kind to omegas in power. 2 weeks later, the annual shareholders gala arrived. It was a Shark Tank in black tie. Soren was the main attraction, the curiosity, the scandal. He stood by the champagne tower, looking impeccable in white velvet, but Julian, watching from the periphery, saw the tension in his shoulders. A group of older alpha investors from a rival firm, the chaotic Sterling Corp, surrounded Soren. Charming, one of them, a heavy-set man named Sterling, sneered. I hear the Helios Group is trying a diversity experiment. Tell me, Mr. Kale, do you negotiate contracts on your knees? Is that how you got the Vane legacy? The group laughed. It was crude, disgusting, and meant to break him. Soren stiffened, his glass tightening in his hand. He opened his mouth to retort, a sharp, intellectual barb ready on his tongue, but a shadow fell over the group. Julian Vane stepped into the circle. He didn't look at Sterling. He looked at Soren. Mr. Kale, Julian said, his voice projecting easily over the music. The board is waiting for your keynote. They are quite eager to hear how you raised our profit margins by 15% in a single quarter. A feat, I might add, that Mr. Sterling hasn't achieved in a decade. The laughter died instantly. Sterling turned red. Vane, I see you're still playing guard dog. How does it feel to take orders from a... Careful, Julian cut him off. The menace in his tone was absolute. He stepped closer to Sterling, towering over him. You are speaking to the CEO of Vane Enterprises. You will show him the respect his title demands, or I will personally ensure that your acquisition of the docking yards, which requires my signature on the land rights, burns to the ground. Sterling paled. The threat was real. Julian Vane might not be CEO, but he was still a Vane, and he owned the land. My apologies, Sterling muttered, looking away. Julian turned back to Soren. He bowed his head slightly, a public act of submission that sent ripples through the room. After you, sir. Soren looked at Julian, his eyes wide with surprise, and then something softer. Respect. As they walked away from the stunned group, Soren kept his gaze forward, but his voice was a whisper meant only for Julian. I didn't need you to save me. I know, Julian replied, falling into step half a pace behind him. I didn't do it to save you. I did it because no one insults my superior. Soren smirked. Is that all I am? Ask me later, Julian murmured, his hand brushing against Soren's lower back for a fraction of a second, hidden by the crowd. When we're alone. The real test came a month later. The Helios Group, the very entity that had appointed Soren, decided to liquidate Vane Enterprises. It had been a setup. They hadn't hired Soren to save the company. They had hired him to strip it for parts, banking on the fact that an Omega CEO would be too grateful for the position to question the board's directives. They were wrong. Soren stormed into Julian's office, slamming the door. He was vibrating with rage. They're selling the R&D division. They're gutting your father's legacy. Julian stood up slowly. R&D? That's the heart of the company. If they sell that, we're just a shell. I know. Soren paced the small room. I refuse to sign the order. The chairman told me that if I don't sign, I'm fired. Again. Julian watched him. This was the moment. Soren could save his career by selling out Julian's family heritage. It was the perfect revenge. Julian had fired him. Now Soren could dismantle Julian's life and walk away with a golden parachute. So, Julian said quietly, are you going to sign? Soren stopped pacing. He looked at Julian with fierce intensity. You think I'm that petty? You think I worked this hard just to become a butcher for a conglomerate? No, Julian said. I think you're better than that. I have a plan, Soren said, his mind racing. But it's dangerous. It requires a poison pill strategy. We devalue the stock artificially, trigger a panic, and then buy back the controlling interest ourselves before Helios can liquidate. But we need capital. Liquid capital. Fast. I have the trust fund, Julian said immediately. And the offshore accounts. Soren stared at him. Julian, that's everything you have. If this fails, you'll be destitute. You'd be trusting me, an Omega you once fired, with your entire life. Julian walked around the desk. He stopped in front of Soren, the air between them charged with the history of their conflict and the intensity of their connection. I trusted you with my company when I stepped down, Julian said. I trust you with my money. I trust you with me. Soren searched Julian's face for any sign of deception. He found only resolve. Why? Soren whispered. Because, Julian reached out, finally cupping Soren's face in his large, warm hands. You are the only person who was ever strong enough to challenge me. You didn't just take my chair, Soren. You took my attention. You took my respect. And somewhere in the middle of all this fighting, Julian's thumb brushed Soren's cheekbone. You took my heart. Soren let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for 3 years. He leaned into the touch. If we do this, we're partners. 50-50. No more boss and employee. Equals. Partners, Julian agreed. They initiated the plan the next morning. It was corporate suicide on paper. The stock plummeted. The media screamed that the Omega CEO experiment had failed. The Helios group panicked and tried to dump their shares. And in the chaos, a new holding company, registered under the names Kale and Vane, bought it all back. When the dust settled, they stood in the boardroom again. Just the two of them. The storm outside had passed, leaving a clear, glittering skyline. They owned Vane Enterprises. Not the board. Not Helios. Them. Soren sat on the edge of the conference table, exhausted but triumphant. Julian stood between his legs, his hands resting on Soren's thighs. We lost 40% of the market cap, Julian noted, though he didn't sound worried. We'll earn it back in 6 months, Soren said confidently. He ran his fingers through Julian's hair, tugging gently. Now that I don't have a board of dinosaurs holding me back. And what about me? Julian asked, his voice low, his eyes dark with intent. Am I holding you back? Soren smiled, a genuine, dazzling smile that hit Julian harder than any stock crash. You? No. You're just learning your new position. And what position is that? Soren leaned down, his lips brushing Julian's ear. Mine. And that is how the discarded Omega didn't just return to the pack. He conquered the Alpha who led it. If you enjoyed seeing Julian Vane realize that true power isn't about dominance, but partnership, destroy that like button. And tell me in the comments, would you forgive a man who fired you for your nature, even if he bet his entire fortune to help you win in the end? I'll be reading your answers. Subscribe for the next chapter. Until then,